Today we'll talk about types of scales, and we'll get into these as we kind of keep moving forward. And right into it, we asked a question, and that question is going to be, is your measure quantifiable? And so when you think about what your measure is, oftentimes you're going to throw something at me and I'm going to reply back. How are you going to measure that? And we talked about this a little bit in the winter session, the first year, when we talked about mental toughness. One of the hard things about mental toughness is how are you going to measure it? What are you going to quantify? Is it going to be results? Is it going to be staying power or endurance? And all of those things are hard to do because there are multiple factors, there's multiple variables involved. So whatever your measure is going to be must be something that we can hammer down to be a direct result of the change. And so when you think about the question, is your measure quantifiable? Again, if you're having a hard time answering that question, then you probably don't have you're not on the right track. So types of measurement scales, again, there are four. You have nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal data, you typically have categorical responses. You might ask someone, what do you like about school? What do you like about social media? And people give you results. And those results are in no specific order, and there's no inherent rank order, meaning no response is more important than another. And we'll get into that quite a bit here in the next lecture because nominal data is something that we use quite often. Ordinal data, again, the responses are ordered but not necessarily equally spaced. And when we think about ordinal data, we think about rank order. You know, here are 5 songs, rank them from 1 to 5 as far as your favorite. And maybe number 1 and number 2 are really close, but number 1 and number 5 are light years away. Maybe you don't even recognize that song, but it's on the list, and so you put it last because I don't even know what it is. So the difference in number 1 and number 2 and number 1 and number 5 are astronomically different. So that's ordinal data. And then you have interval data. So responses are ordered and equally spaced, meaning that's your typical Likert scale stuff. You have strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Everything's equally spaced, number 1 through 5, 1 being the least favorite, 5 being the most. Rank these or put these in order. I'm not a big fan of interval stuff, the Likert stuff, because it's hard, but it's very, very easy from a research standpoint because you know kind of how people feel, or at least you can justify that with those responses. Then the last one is ratio data. And in ratio data, we have equal intervals, but more importantly, we have a true 0 point. So sometimes when there's a response that the answer could be 0, meaning on a test, you might have gotten 0 right. Well, that's a ratio. If you had height, weight, you can have 0 as an option. So ratio data is a true 0 point, and we'll get into those examples here in the next lecture. So a couple of things to remember as we get into going individually on these types of data or these types of measurement scale, and that is that data is plural. So anytime that you're writing a sentence with the word data, come up with some other word that's plural and put it in there. For example, if you're saying that the data is impactful, that sounds correct. But if you change the word data and put another word that's plural, the squirrels is impactful. Well, or impactful. Well, you wouldn't say that. You would say the squirrels are impactful. So you have to really think about that. When you're writing academically, data is plural, so the data are impactful. And again, it doesn't read well, and when you read it out loud, you're going to think, oh, I've got to do this again. But remember, data is plural. And then finally, we're going to start talking quite a bit about parametric versus non-parametric data. We did this a lot in Research 1. If you're not sure, go back and look at those notes. But really quick, parametric data are basically a normal distributed data versus non-parametric, which is abnormal distribution, meaning there is no normal curve. There is no normal distribution of this data. Typically, when we're dealing with non-parametric data, in order to achieve the same power that we might get in a parametric study, we've got to have a large sample size. And that's one of the things moving forward in this program, you're not going to have things with large sample size. In sports science, we're typically not dealing with large sample size. So you're not necessarily going to see those big high numbers that you might read about in journal articles, but it doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile study or investigation. So we'll get into those, but go back and review those if you're having trouble. And again, we're about to start breaking these down. So we're going to try to keep these lectures to under 10 minutes at most. And so there are going to be a lot of them, and they're going to be broken up. But this way, I think it'll be easier for you to go back and find information that you need. So if you have questions, let me know. But I will be back soon with nominal data.